Shana Tova, everyone. How I wish we could be here together, hearing words of Torah and greeting each other and praying together and talking together. I hope you're having a meaningful fast and that this day is providing ample opportunities for deep reflection and reflection on our inner souls and how we're going to do different work for the year ahead. So today's Torah reading comes from the book of Leviticus, and it lays out the template for the first Yom Kippur, which I'll talk about in a moment. And that template becomes the rabbinic template for us, that in place of the avodah, in place of the sacrifices that the high priest, Aaron, and his sons eventually will bring, we have the avodah shebalev. We have the service of the heart. We have prayer and good deeds and acts of tshuva, acts of atonement. But having said that, there's already implied here a kind of haunting absence in at least two ways. One is that where we are in the Torah right now comes after we've already read about the deaths of Aaron's sons, Nadav and Avihu, for bringing incense that wasn't actually prescribed by God to bring. And when they do that, as we read back a couple of parshiot in Parshat Shmini, they're consumed by heavenly fire on the altar. And then Moses explains why that happened. And Aaron's response is silence. The Torah simply says, Vayidom Aharon. And part of me wonders if the rabbis chose this portion for the first Yom Kippur, not only because it speaks explicitly about Yom Kippur and this expiation ritual, but if there's something here for us about this kind of awed silence when we come to this day and we reflect on the fragility of our lives and we reflect on the enormity, the spiritual enormity of the work of tshuva we have to do. There, of course, is another haunting silence here, which is that the rabbis understood full well that what they were giving us by means of rituals and texts and teachings for atonement was only in a world without a temple, to which the temple would not return. And so there's always a series of questions hanging over Yom Kippur. One is whether or not it's actually adequate. If we don't have the kinds of rituals our spiritual ancestors had to expiate us of our missteps and our wrongdoings, can we truly make atonement? Now, the rabbi's answer to that is yes, that in place of expiation we have many things. We have prayer, we have acts of kindness, we even have study, that studying the sacrifices themselves are almost in place of actually performing those sacrifices, because study too is a kind of sacrifice of the heart. But there's something else here, which is the rabbis fully believed that through our acts of kindness to each other and our acts of repair to each other, we really are affecting tshuva just as well as when the temple stood. And so our own lives kind of become an argument against God. You did this to us. You brought the Romans, you brought the Babylonians, we have no more temple anymore, and yet here we are striving to lead lives of conscience and of compassion. And so now, Creator of the universe, what will you do for us? And we see this argument and traces of it throughout the high holidays. So now we'll start with the first Aliyah, where we have the figure of Aharon as the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, enacting a series of expiations in concentric circles of relationship. And in this first Aliyah, we see him making expiation for himself and his household. וידבר אדוני אל משה אחרי מות שני בני אהרון בקרבתם לפני אדוני וימותו ויאמר אדוני אל משה דבר אל אהרון אחיך ואל יבוא בכל עת אל הקודש מבית לפרוכת אל פני הכפורת אשר על הארון ולא ימות כי בענן יראה על הכפורת בזאת יבוא אהרון אל הקודש בפר בן בקר לחטאת וילאו לה כתונת בד קודש ילבש ובמכנסי בד יועל בשרו ובאבנית בד יחגור ובמצנפת בד יצנוף בגדי קודש הם ורחץ במים את בשרו ולבשם, ומאת עדת בני ישראל ייקח 2 שעירי עזים לחטאת, ויל אחד לעולה, והקריב אהרון את פר החטאת אשר לו, וכיפר בעדו ובעד ביתו. Couple of quick thoughts before the second Aliyah. I mentioned before that what we see here laid out in the Torah portion are these concentric circles of relationship. That first, Aharon, the high priest, makes expiation for himself and his household, and then we're going to see later in this parsha how he makes expiation for the entire people. And in the next Aliyah, we're introduced to the notion of the scapegoat, and how there are these 2 goats that are chosen by chance, by lottery. One to be the scapegoat that Aaron releases into the desert to certain death eventually, and one that's slaughtered upon the altar. And as I think of this as how this might be a template for Yom Kippur, well, one piece of it is pretty clear to me, that the concentric circles of relationship mirror the ways in which Yom Kippur has become a holiday about repairing relationships with other people. But what about the scapegoat? And what about the kind of automatic expiation and the letting go that happens with the scapegoat? How does that come into the holiday? And I've always been perplexed by this, because there's nothing, except there are some customs, but there's almost nothing, certainly in the normative tradition, that we do where we transfer our sins to something and let it go and spiritually cleanse ourselves. But then I actually thought of how this holiday is thought of and conceived by the rabbis, and we see this in the Mishnah, how the rabbis are very clear that there are perpendicular axes about how this holiday is charted. And the rabbis understand full well, and they're very explicit about this, that all of the rituals and the fasting of Yom Kippur only affects tshuva between ourselves and God. So whatever isn't right spiritually, whatever we look at in our lives that wasn't quite right, not with respect to other people, but with respect to our connection to the source of all creation, the source of all morality, that Yom Kippur wipes that clean. We can let go of that, just like the scapegoat. We do these rituals, the day itself, right, makes that atonement. But when it comes to other people, we're on our own. That Yom Kippur doesn't affect atonement until we actually go to other people and repair those relationships. So perhaps there's some parallel here to the dichotomy between the scapegoat on the one hand, that Aaron the high priest lets go, and the concentric circles of relationship where we contend with people all the time, trying to make those relationships whole. Now I'll chant the second Aliyah. ונתן אהרון על 2 השעירים גורלות, גורל אחד לאדוני וגורל אחד לעזאזל, והקריב אהרון את השעיר אשר עלה עליו, הגורל לאדוני, ועשהו חטאת, והשעיר אשר עלה עליו, הגורל לעזאזל, יומם חי, לפני אדוני לכפר עליו, לשלח אותו לעזאזל המדברה, והקריב אהרון את פר החטאת אשר לו, וכיפר בעדו ובעד ביתו, ושחט את פר החטאת אשר לו. One introduction for the third and fourth Aliyah. In the third Aliyah, we are introduced to the incense, and we see Aharon, the high priest, take one of the goats that was chosen by lottery as a sacrifice upon the altar that makes expiation not only for himself and his household, but for the entire community. And then after that, we see him, in the fourth Aliyah, we see him attending to the scapegoat, and he does something very interesting. He places his hands on the head of the goat and makes a confession, and through that confession transfers all the sins of the people onto the goat. Now it's very interesting because that to us may seem kind of like, sort of a magical ritual that we wouldn't do anymore. But what's quite interesting is if we look to this Torah portion, its rituals as a template, is that in the late 12th, early 13th century, when Moses Maimonides, the great rationalist philosopher, was going through the Talmud and distilling the laws of tshuva, he said that the one aspect of the ancient ritual that's found in the Torah that still remains is the confession. And I found that quite powerful. I've always found that quite powerful for a number of reasons. One, that there's something about the human voice, and there's something about drawing on our own voices to activate our will and our conscience to express what it is that we did wrong. But there's something else here too, which is that the way Maimonides understands the confession is completely different from how the Torah understands the confession. That the Torah understands it as a symbolic transferal of all the sins onto the goat, thereby relieving the people of the sins. But Maimonides doesn't understand it that way at all. Instead, it's a form of moral reckoning. It's a form of making public that which would otherwise be private. It's a way of restoring order and balance to people individually and to society, and yet it's taken from this very moment. And of course now, for those moments of confession, we have the piyutim, the poems, the Al-Chet and the Yashamnu, which we sing throughout the holiday. And so now I'll continue chanting the third and then the fourth Aliyah. ולקח מלוא המחתה גחלש מעל המזבח מלפני אדוני מלוא חופניו כתורת סמים דקה והביא מבית לפרוכת ונתן את הקטורת על האש לפני אדוני וכיסה ענן הקטורת את הכפורת אשר על העדות ולא ימות ולקח מדם הפר והיזה באצבעו על פני הכפורת קדמה ולפני הכפורת יזה 7 פעמים מן הדם באצבעו ושחט את שעיר החטאת אשר לעם והביא את דמו אל מבית לפרוכת ועשה את דמו כאשר עשה לדם הפר והיזה אותו על הכפורת ולפני הכפורת וכיפר על הקודש מטומאות בני ישראל מפשעיהם לכל חטאותם וכן יעשה לאוהל מועד השוכן איתם בתוך טומאותם וכל אדם לא יהיה באוהל מועד בבואו לכפר בקודש עד צאתו וכיפר בעדו ובעד ביתו ובעד כל קהל ישראל. This is the fourth Aliyah. ויצא אל המזבח אשר לפני אדוני וכיפר עליו ולקח מדם הפר ומדם השעיר ונתן על קרנות המזבח סביב והיזה עליו מן הדם באצבעו 7 פעמים וטיהרו וקידשו מטומאות בני ישראל וכילה מכפר את הקודש ואת אוהל מועד ואת המזבח והקריב את השעיר החי ושמח אהרון את 2 ידיו על ראש השעיר החי והתוודה עליו את כל עוונות בני ישראל ואת כל פשעיהם לכל חטאותם ונתן אותם על ראש השעיר ושילח ביד איש איתי המדברה ונשא השעיר עליו את כל עוונותם אל ארץ גזירה ושילח את השעיר במדבר ובא אהרון אל אוהל מועד ופשט את בגדי הבד אשר לבש בבוא אל הקודש והניחם שם ורחץ את בשרו במים במקום קדוש ולבש את בגדיו יצא ועשה את עולתו ואת עולת העם וכיפר בעדו ובעד העם. I'll give this one introduction to the 5th and 6th aliyot, and here we have kind of the denouement of the parsha. And we see that after the ritual is over, the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, but also all those who are tending to the remains of the sacrifices have to go through their own purification ritual again. And we see this other places in the Torah, that the people who are responsible for purifying the community themselves become associated with some kind of taint. We don't know where it comes from exactly, but enough that they have to go back and re-purify themselves, and only after that can they enter the camp. Even though the rabbis didn't say this explicitly, I kind of believe that the rabbis sort of latched onto this idea that there's no purity in the world in their conception of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, because they acknowledge that among human beings, maybe a few are completely righteous. But most of us are in between, kind of living on the cusp of lives that are righteous and lives where we have work to do. And so we all make decisions, but nevertheless, the rabbis say, and because of this, the rabbis say, that a person who does tshuva, that they reach a kind of moral high ground that people who've been completely righteous never get to, because they never had to have that struggle. And there's certainly a lot more to say about that. And finally, in the final aliyah, we read two very interesting things that may appear sort of contradictory. One is that as a festival that's to be repeated each year, that the people are supposed to afflict their souls. And of course, the way the rabbis understand that is that we afflict our souls through fasting and refraining from other pleasures and things that we do in the course of our day, eating, drinking, washing, that kind of thing. But also, the Torah says that it should be a Shabbat Shabbaton, not only a day of rest, but a day of rest of a day of rest. So there's a way in which Yom Kippur is both. It's a day that we do without, but perhaps in creating this uniquely sacred time, we have a kind of luxury of reflection and the ability to go deeper, and then through that, by changing ourselves to bring more goodness and compassion to the world. Before we read this fifth and sixth aliyah, I just want to give a brief overview and introduction to the end of the parsha. Most years on Yom Kippur, I spend so much time on what I think is the central meaning that I don't get to really talk about the fifth and sixth aliyah. And in the fifth aliyah, we see the reintegration after all the sacrifices are performed. Aaron is the Kohen Gadol, and other priests who have to dispense with and deal with the remains of the sacrifices all have to re-purify themselves in order to enter the camp. And there's a compelling reality here that's expressed other places in the Torah, that those who are responsible for somehow purifying the camp themselves receive a kind of taint of impurity, and so have to get rid of that before they come back into the camp. And the rabbis certainly understood that there was no purity in the world, not just ritually, but morally also, that at any time, the rabbis understood that in the entire world there were only 36 people who were completely righteous, and they double chai, and they sustained the world, and the rest of us have a mix. And we're Benoni'im, we're in between, and we work on ourselves so that we can be as righteous and as compassionate as we can be. Now, there's something at the end of the parsha that I've always felt was a kind of ironic contradiction, that on the one hand, this is a day to afflict our souls. That's what the Torah says, and the rabbis understood that to mean that we refrain from eating and drinking and washing and anointing ourselves. But it also says that it should be a Shabbat Shabbaton, not just a Shabbat, which itself would be a day of rest and renewal, but a double portion of Shabbat, a Shabbat Shabbaton, a uniquely renewing Shabbat. And so the puzzle for us is, how does this day become both? How does it become a day in which we take a step back from all the ways in which we feed and nurture our body and external selves? And how does that become, in and of itself, a day of great renewal, a day in which we have this great luxury of being able to go inward and go deeper and think about how we repair both our essential spiritual relationship, but also relationships which are no less spiritual with other people in our lives. So here are the fifth and sixth aliyot. ואת חלב החטאת יקטיר המזבחה, והמשלח את השעיר לעזאזל, יחפש בגדיו ורחץ את בשרו במים, ואחרי כן יבוא אל המחנה, ואת פר החטאת, ואת שעיר החטאת, אשר הובא את דמם לכפר בקודש, יוציא אל מחוץ למחנה, ושרף באש, ושרפו באש את אורותם ואת בשרם ואת פרשם. והשורף אותם יכבס בגדיו ורחץ את בשרו במים, ואחרי כן יבוא אל המחנה. והייתה לכם לחוקת עולם בחודש השביעי בעשור לחודש, תענו את נפשותיכם וכל מלאכה לא תעשו, האזרח והגר הגר בתוככם, כי ביום הזה יכפר עליכם לטהר אתכם מכל חטאותיכם לפני אדוני תטהרו. This is the sixth aliyah. שבת, שבתון היא לכם, ויניתם את נפשותיכם, חוקת עולם. וכיפר הכהן, אשר ימשך אותו, ואשר ימלא את ידו לכהן תחת אביו, ולבש את בגדי הבד בגדי הקודש. וכיפר את מקדש הקודש, ואת אוהל מועד ואת המזבח יכפר, ועל הכהנים ועל כל עם הקהל יכפר, והייתה זאת לכם לחוקת עולם, לכפר על בני ישראל מכל חטאותם אחת בשנה, ויעש כאשר ציווה אדוני את משה. And this is the Maftir reading, which puts front and center the motif of Ve'ini temet nafshotechem, of afflicting our souls, which the Torah doesn't tell us exactly what they meant by that, but the rabbis do. But interestingly, how here, as opposed to the first Torah reading, the whole idea of afflicting ourselves is bound up with all the other rituals of sacrifice. And interestingly, that will become a motif in the Haftarah, which we'll chant just after this Maftir portion. So if you're following along in the Machzor, the Maftir portion is on page 282 at the bottom of the page. So we're about to read the Maftir reading, which interestingly, the first thing that's mentioned here is, or among the first things that's mentioned here is Ve'ini temet nafshotechem, the affliction of the souls, whereas last in the portion in Leviticus it comes at the end. Here it comes at the beginning, and I take this as a suggestion that the affliction of souls was bound up with all the sacrifices, which Isaiah will comment on in an ironic way in just a little bit when we chant from the Haftarah. If you're following along in the Machzor, the Maftir portion is found at the bottom of page 282. ועשור לחודש השביעי הזה, מקרא קודש יהיה לכם, ויניתם את נפשותיכם, כל מלאכה לא תעשו. והקרבתם עולה לאדוני ריח ניחוח, פר בן בקר אחד איל אחד, כבשים בני שנה, 7 תמימים יהיו לכם, ומנחתם סולת בלולב השמן, 3 עשרונים לפר, 2 עשרונים לאיל האחד, עשרון לכבש האחד, לשבעת הכבשים, זריזים אחד חטאת, מלבד חטאת הכיפורים ועולת התמיד, ומנחתיו נזקיהם. Haftarah reading, and I find this Haftarah reading from Isaiah to be just luminous for all kinds of reasons. But 2 that are on my mind right now. One is that while we just spent some time looking closely at the Torah portion and the ritual that was prescribed there, Isaiah speaks to his people, the people who were anticipating a return to Jerusalem from exile in Babylonia, and excoriating them for focusing on the forms of prayer and the outward forms of tshuva, but not attending to the real suffering in their midst, the homelessness, the poverty, and the moral corruption. And what also strikes me about this Haftarah is actually how radical it is. It's not the first Haftarah it's not the first moment in the prophets where the prophets talk about tshuva and renewal. But what strikes me about this is that whereas the earlier discourses on tshuva speak about renewal in sort of the natural realm, this speaks of renewal and tshuva in the supernatural realm, and poses the possibility that if the people really take care of the society and look out for who's most vulnerable and who's most oppressed and who's most poor and help them, that, and these are the words of Isaiah, that your light will break forth like the dawn, your evening will be like noonday. There will be this supernatural divine light that permeates everything and at all times. And I think it's a measure of not the impossibility of this kind of moral restoration, but a measure of how grand it is and how radical it is whenever we do it. And so with these thoughts in mind, we'll turn to the Haftarah, page 284 in the Machzor. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar b'nviim tovim v'ratza v'divreihem hanemarim be'emet Baruch atah Adonai habocher b'Torah uv'Moshe avdo uv'Yisrael amo ובנביאי האמת והצדק. ואמר סולו פנו דרך, הריבו מכשול מדרך עמי, כי כה אמר רם ונישא, שוכן נער וקדוש שמו, מרום וקדוש אשכון, וצדקה ושפל רוח, להחיות רוח שפלים, ולהחיות לב נדכאים. כי לא לעולם אריב ולא לנצח אקצוף, כי רוח מלפני יעטוף, ונשמות אני עשיתי. בעוון ביצעו, קצפתי ועקהו, הסתר ואקצוף, וילך שובב בדרך ליבו. דרכיו ראיתי וארפאהו, ואנחהו, ואשלם ניחומים לו, ולאבליו בורא ניב שפתיים, שלום שלום, לרחוק ולקרוב, אמר אדוני ורפאתיו. והרשעים קיים נגרש, כי השקט לא יוכל, ויגרשו מימיו רפש ותית, אין שלום אמר אלוהי לרשעים. קרא וגרון אל תחשוך, בשופר הרם קולך, והגד לה מפשעם, ולבית יעקב חטאותם. ואותי יום יום ידרושון, ודעת דרכי יחפצון, כגוי אשר צדקה עשה, ומשפט אלוהיו לא עזב. ישאלוני משפטי צדק, קרבת אלוהים יחפצון. למה צמנו ולא ראית? עינינו נפשנו ולא תדע. הן ביום צומכם תמצאו חפץ, וכל עצביכם תנגושו. הן לריב ומצה תצומו, ולהכות באגרוף רשע. לא תצומו כיום, להשמיע במרום קולכם. החזה יהיה צום אבחרהו, יום ענות אדם נפשו, הלחוף כאגמון ראשו, ושק ואפר יציע, הלזה תקרא צום, ויום רצון לאדוני. הלא זה צום אבחרהו, פתח חרצובות רשע, התר אגודות מותה, ושלח רצוצים חופשיים, וחומותה תנתקו. הלא פרוס לרעב לחמך, ועניים מרודים תביא בבית, כי תראה ערום וכיסיתו, ומבשרך לא תתעלם. אז יבקע כשחר אורך, ברוכתך מהרת תצמח, והלך לפניך צדקך, כבוד אדוני יאספך. אז תקרב אדוני יענה, תשבע ויאמר הנני, אם תסיר מתוכך מותה, שלח אצבע ודבר אבן, ותפק לרעב נפשך, ונפש נענה תשביע, וזרח בחושך אורך, ואפלתך כצהריים. ונכך אדוני תמיד, והשביע בצחצחות נפשך, ועצמותיך יחליץ, והיית כגן רבה, וכמוצא מים, אשר לא יכזבו מימיו, ובנו ממך חורבות עולם, מוסדי דור ודור תקומם, וקורא לך גודר פרץ, משובב נתיבות לשבת. אם תשיב משבת רגלך, עשות חפצך ביום קודשי, וקראת לשבת עונג, ולקדוש אדוני מכובד, וכיבדתו מעשות דרכך. ממצוא חפצך ודבר דבר, אז תתענג על אדוני, והרכבתיך על במתי הארץ, והאכלתיך נחלת יעקב אביך, כי פי אדוני דיבר. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, צור כל העולמים, צדיק בכל הדורות, האל הנאמן, האומר ויעשה, המדבר ומקיים, שכל דבריו אמת וצדק. נאמן אתה הוא אדוני אלוהינו, ונאמנים דבריך, ודבר אחד מדבריך חור לא ישוב ריקם, כי אל מלך נאמן ורחמן אתה. ברוך אתה אדוני האל הנאמן בכל דבריו. רחם על ציון כי בית חיינו, ולעלובת נפש תושיע במהרה בימינו. ברוך אתה אדוני משמח ציון בבניה. שמחנו אדוני אלוהינו באליהו הנביא עבדך, ובמלכות בית דוד משיחך. במהרה יבוא ויגל ליבנו, על כיסאו לא ישב זר, ולא ינחלו עוד אחרים את כבודו. כי בשם קודשך נשבעת לו, שלא יכפנה לו לעולם ועד. ברוך אתה אדוני מגן דוד. על התורה ועל העבודה ועל הנביאים ועל יום הכיפורים הזה, שנתת לנו אדוני אלוהינו, למחילה ולסליחה ולכפרה, לכבוד ולתפארת. על הכל אדוני אלוהינו אנחנו מודים לך ומברכים אותך, יתברך שמך בפי כל חי תמיד עולם ועד, ודברך אמת וקיים לעד. ברוך אתה אדוני מלך מוחל וסולח לעוונותינו ולעוונות עמו בית ישראל, ומעביר אשמותינו בכל שנה ושנה. מלך על כל הארץ, מקדש ישראל ויום הכיפורים. שנה טובה.